That morning, Victoria Crane stepped out of her white Range Rover, looked at the rust-patched Chevy Silverado parked 2 spaces away, and laughed. Not the kind of laugh a person tries to suppress, the kind that gets out before the mind can stop it. Unguarded, flat, certain of itself, the truck was old enough to have a story. The man standing next to it was black, broad-shouldered, somewhere in his late 50s, wearing a canvas work jacket with a split seam at the left elbow. He did not look at her. He closed the tailgate carefully, the way a man closes a door when a child is sleeping inside, and drove out of the parking lot without a word. His name was Denzel Washington, and 3 hours later, Victoria Crane was standing on the roof of her Range Rover in the middle of a flooded service road off County Route 7, water past her knees and rising, 1 bar of signal on her phone, watching that same Silverado come toward her through the rain like the one thing she had already decided did not matter. Don't look away, because what Denzel kept beneath all that rust and silence weighed more than any truck ever could. And what happened in the weeks after that flooded road would cost Victoria Crane everything she thought she had built. But we'll get to that. First, we need to go back to the kind of morning that doesn't photograph well but stays with you anyway. Denzel Washington woke at 5:22 every morning without an alarm. He had not set one in 4 years. His body had decided on its own schedule sometime after he moved back to Crestfield, Georgia, and he had stopped arguing with it. He would dress in the dark, brew coffee in the kitchens with the window cracked, and stand there for the length of 1 full cup looking out at the yard where his daughter Celeste had once kept a garden. She called her thinking garden. The raised beds were still there. He maintained them, though nothing grew in them, now that she was in grad school in Chapel Hill. He maintained them because she said she would come back to them, and Denzel was the kind of man who kept things ready. The house was a 3-bedroom ranch on Birchwood Trail, set back from the road behind 2 old oaks whose roots had started lifting the driveway in the front corner. He had patched that section of concrete twice. He would patch it again. The floors inside were level, the windows sealed, the furnace replaced the winter before last. It was not a house that announced itself. It was a house that worked. The Silverado was backed into the gravel side drive every evening, the way a man parks when he knows he might need to move fast. It was a 1997 model, the deep red faded out to something closer to brown under the wheel wells, the passenger mirror replaced with one that didn't quite match. It ran. That was what Denzel said when people at Franklin's Hardware on Elm Street mentioned it, which they sometimes did. It runs. He said it without apology, without humor, without any suggestion that the subject required further comment. That Tuesday, he drove to Millhaven Elementary to pick up his neighbor's daughter, Ava, 18 years old, who sometimes helped him with afternoon deliveries, and who he had agreed to drive to her community college orientation on the east side of town. She climbed in with a folder of papers pressed against her chest and said without preamble that her orientation counselor had told her she should think about being realistic with her major choices. Denzel waited until he had pulled out of the lot before he spoke. He asked her what she wanted to study. She said electrical engineering. He drove 2 blocks before saying anything. Then he said, "Get a second counselor." He stopped at Ruth Jennings's house on Crawford Street because her circuit breaker had been tripping twice a week since September, and she had mentioned it 3 times in the way people mention things when they are hoping someone will volunteer. He replaced a faulty breaker and checked the panel for ground faults while Ava waited in the truck with her folder. Ruth pressed a tin of oatmeal cookies into his hands when he was done and told him he was a good man. He told her she said that to everyone who fixed her breaker. She told him the last electrician had charged her $340 and done it wrong. He told her this one was free. She told him that was why she said it. There was a compartment in the center console of the Silverado that Denzel did not open when anyone else was in the truck. Inside it, a folded receipt from a FedEx office, a spare blade for his utility knife, and a laminated ID card that had been snapped cleanly in 2 and never discarded. The name on it read Meridian Grid Partners, the logo rendered in clean dark blue type. Below the logo, in smaller text, Senior Infrastructure Architect, Grid Systems Division, Southeast Region. Denzel had spent 11 years at Meridian, not managing field crews, not supervising other engineers. He had designed the load-balancing architecture for the regional power distribution network, covering portions of Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, and the Western Carolinas. He had been the person the other engineers called when the math stopped making sense and the timeline did not move. He had solved two grid instability crises in the same quarter, once overnight, once over a weekend, with a borrowed laptop and a cold cup of coffee. He did not talk about that in Crestfield. He had not talked about it anywhere in a long time. That evening, he drove out to Gaines Supply on Pratt Road to look at a panel job the owner, Earl Gaines, had been nursing since the spring. Earl mentioned, while Denzel was checking connections, that a developer from Nashville had been nosing around the commercial district on Main Street. Said the woman had met with 3 landlords already and left written offers with 2 of them. Said the numbers were fair on paper and conditional on city council approval for a zoning variance. Denzel tightened the last lug, replaced the panel cover, and said he hoped Earl got what the place was worth. Earl said the place was worth more than any developer from Nashville could put on paper because some things had a value that didn't fit on a term sheet. Denzel drove home in the kind of light rain that doesn't commit to anything. The radio mentioned a tropical system tracking northeast from the Gulf Coast. He looked at the sky through the windshield. The oaks over the driveway were still. He parked and went inside. Victoria Crane had not planned to spend more than 48 hours in Crestfield. She had a full week scheduled in Atlanta. 3 investor calls, a financing review for a commercial redevelopment fund, and a dinner with a capital partner she had been cultivating for most of the year. But the Crestfield Corridor project, as she and her operations director Nathan Foss had taken to calling it internally, was the most promising acquisition opportunity Crane Capital Ventures had identified in over 3 years. The thesis was clean. A tired commercial strip in a secondary Georgia market underpriced by every metric firm typically tracked, sitting directly in the path of a state highway expansion that would, within 4 to 5 years, substantially increase traffic volume through the county. Victoria had been right about 3 deals structured on identical logic. She trusted the pattern the way athletes trust form. She didn't examine it, she used it. Nathan had driven them down from Atlanta on Wednesday morning while Victoria finished a call in the back seat, second laptop open beside her, a half-finished protein bar resting forgotten on the armrest. She was 36 years old, ran a company with 43 employees and a portfolio approaching 9 figures, and wore those facts with the ease of someone who has never seriously questioned whether they deserved them. She had come from money, the old Georgia kind, had doubled it, and had stopped drawing the line between earned and inherited at some point in her early 30s when it had started to feel like a distinction that served no one. The parking lot at Moran's Market on Route 12 was where she first saw the truck and the man beside it, and where she made the sound she would spend more time thinking about than she expected. It was not a deliberate sound. It was a reflex, the kind that escapes a person who has organized the world into clean categories and placed rust, age, and visible wear into the category marked not relevant. Nathan said something quietly beside her, something about the truck looking like it belonged behind a barn, and she didn't correct him. She let it land. She would think about that later, too. The man loading paper bags into the truck bed had heard both of them. He closed the tailgate with that same careful, unhurried motion, got in, and pulled out without looking back. In the cab beside him, a young woman with a folder in her lap looked out the window for a moment as the truck passed, then looked forward again. Victoria met with Earl Gaines that afternoon in the back of his supply store, at a folding table stacked with invoices and a coffee maker that looked like it had been there longer than the building. She laid out her preliminary offer. She talked about infrastructure investment, projected foot traffic, commercial revitalization. Earl Gaines listened the way a man listens when he already knows what his answer is but hasn't decided yet whether to make the conversation short or long. He told her the building had been in his family since his uncle opened it after coming home from Korea in 1953, and that some things were not for sale regardless of the math. Victoria left her offer in writing and told him to take his time. She met with 2 other property owners on Main Street that afternoon, received polite uncertainty from one and a firm no from the other, and returned to the motel on Route 9 to find that Nathan had already begun identifying secondary parcels that might allow the project to proceed at reduced scale. It was a workable fallback position. Victoria didn't like fallback positions. She sat at the small desks in her room and opened the zoning map on her laptop. That was when she found the issue that would not go away. The eastern boundary of the proposed development corridor ran within 60 meters of a secondary substation on county infrastructure. Not the main grid tie point, which was clean, but a secondary distribution node that had been flagged in a state utility audit 2 years ago for load capacity concerns. The note in the public filing was technical and brief, but what it meant, if she was reading it correctly, was that any significant electrical load increase in the development zone, the kind a commercial anchor tenant would generate, could trigger a mandatory grid upgrade. And a mandatory grid upgrade, if the county infrastructure office agreed with the flag, could add costs and delays that changed the entire financial structure of the deal. She forwarded the document to her infrastructure analyst in Atlanta. He called her back 20 minutes later and confirmed her reading. He said he could not give her a definitive risk assessment without a local grid specialist, someone who actually knew the county's secondary distributions architecture, not just the state-level filings. She asked how long finding one would take. He said finding a qualified one days, finding one who knew this specific system possibly longer. She stared at the zoning map for a while, then she closed the laptop and went to bed. The storms came on Friday faster and harder than the forecast had indicated. By 9 in the morning, County Route 7 east of Crestfield had 2 inches of standing water on the low section near the creek bridge. By 10, the creek had overrun its eastern bank. Victoria had driven that road the day before to look at a parcel on the far side. She drove it again Friday morning because she wanted to photograph the eastern boundary line in daylight before heading back to Atlanta. Nathan had already left the night before. She was alone. She got through the low section the first time, barely, felt the water climbing the door sill higher than she had expected, and told herself it was fine. She photographed what she needed. On the way back, the water was 6 inches higher. The Range Rover made it 40 meters into the section before it stalled. She tried to restart it twice. The engine did not respond. The water was at the door handles before she climbed through the window onto the roof. She had 1 bar of signal. She called 911. The dispatcher told her emergency units were responding to a multi-vehicle incident on the county road north of town, and she was 4th in the queue. She called Nathan. He was 2 hours out and could not get back faster. She stood on the roof of her Range Rover in the rain and watched the water rise and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific physical sensation of having made a mistake that the money could not fix. The Silverado came around the bend, on the high side of the road 12 minutes later, its amber hazard lights on, moving steadily through water that was past its running boards. It stopped 20 feet away. Denzel Washington climbed out, moved through the water without hesitation, brought a length of tow rope from the truck bed, looped it around the Range Rover's front tow hook with the efficiency of someone who has done this before, and drove her vehicle to high ground before the creek crested another 8 inches. He did not ask her name. He asked if she was injured. She said no. He handed her a dry jacket from behind the seat and told her he would drive her to the nearest shelter point, which was the community hall on Crawford Street. She got in. The cab smelled like coffee and machine oil. Ava's folder was still on the floor. Nobody said anything for the first 2 minutes. Then Victoria said, "I saw you in the parking lot on Wednesday, at Morrison's." Denzel looked at the road. She said, "I laughed at your truck." He said nothing. She said, "So did my colleague," and I let him. Denzel drove through the intersection at Elm and turned onto Crawford. He said, "I know." She said, "I want to say that directly rather than carry it around." He said, "All right." She said, "It wasn't a decision, it was a reflex." He said, "Most things are." She looked out the window at the rain. He pulled up to the community hall and stopped the truck. Before she got out, she asked him what he did for work. He paused for just a beat, the smallest possible hesitation, and said he did electrical work around the county. She nodded. She said she was actually looking for someone who understood the local grid architecture near the Route 12 corridor. He said that was a fairly specific thing to be looking for. She said she had a technical problem that her team in Atlanta couldn't resolve without local knowledge. She described it briefly: the secondary substation, the load flag in the state audit, the capacity question. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said the county secondary distribution on that corridor runs on a non-standard relay configuration that was installed in 2009 when the state upgraded the main trunk but left the eastern spur on the old spec. The flag in the audit is real. The risk is real, but the fix is not as expensive as the filing implies because the actual constraint is in the feeder breaker at the junction box on Holloway Road, not in the substation itself. If you replace that component and rebalance the load on the east leg, you solve the capacity problem for roughly 40% of what the audit estimate suggests. Victoria looked at him. She said, "How do you know that?" He said, "Because I helped design that part of the network 11 years ago." The silence in the cab of the Silverado was the kind that rearranges things. She said, "Who are you?" He said, "Denzel Washington." She said she meant what was his background. He said he used to work at Meridian Grid Partners as a senior infrastructure architect. He said he had left and come back home and opened a small electrical contracting business. He said he hadn't planned to get back into grid-level work. He said this in the same tone he used when talking about Ruth Jennings's breaker, measured, without drama, the voice of a man who long ago stopped performing his own credentials. Victoria sat with that for a moment, then she asked if she could call him. He said she could. He handed her a card. It had his name, a local phone number, and the words Washington Electrical underneath, printed on plain white cardstock, no logo. Nothing unnecessary. She called Nathan from the community hall. She told him what had happened. She told him what Denzel had said about the substation. Nathan was quiet for a moment and then said, "If that's accurate, it changes the whole infrastructure cost projection." She said it was accurate. She could tell from the way he had said it. What came next moved faster than Victoria had anticipated, and not entirely in the direction she expected. She revised the infrastructure section of the project proposal over the weekend, incorporating the feeder breaker correction and the revised cost estimate. She sent it to her analyst in Atlanta. He confirmed the technical logic was sound. She restructured the financial model on Sunday night and found that the corrected numbers improved the deal's first decade return by more than she had projected in the original thesis. The project was not just viable, it was stronger than she had sold to her partners. She also found something else, something she had not been looking for. Going back through the public records related to the Route 12 corridor, Nathan had pulled the original grid infrastructure filings from the county utilities office. The design documentation for the secondary distribution network, the one Denzel had described with such precision, listed the lead architect by name. The engineering firm was a Nashville-based contractor no longer in operation, but the individual credit on the technical design submission, buried in the appendix of a filing nobody had looked at in over a decade, read D. A. Washington, senior architect, Meridian Grid Partners. Nathan called her at 7 in the morning on Monday and read it to her. She was already awake. She was sitting at the small desk in the motel room with her second cup of coffee, and the zoning map still open on her laptop and the white cardstock with Washington Electrical sitting face up beside it. She already knew before Nathan finished the sentence. She thought about the parking lot on Wednesday morning, the sound she had made. The words Nathan had said beside her and that she had let pass without comment. She thought about the man who had heard it, who had closed his tailgate and driven away without a word, who had come back through a flooded road in the rain without being asked, who had told her in a truck cab what her entire Atlanta infrastructure team could not have told her, and who had done all of it without once mentioning that he had built the system she was asking about. She put the cup down. She sat with that for a while. She called Earl Gaines that morning and asked if she could come back in. Earl said he'd have the coffee on. She drove to the supply store on Pratt Road and sat at the same folding table. She told him the project had been revised. She told him the original proposal had not accounted for the true infrastructure situation and that the corrected version included a component he might want to hear. She laid out the new plan, It included a full replacement of the feeder breaker system on the Route 12 East Corridor as a project infrastructure commitment funded by Crane Capital before a single shovel touched the ground. It included a 10-year commercial lease protection clause for every current Main Street tenant, and it included a community equity partnership structure that gave participating local businesses a preferred supplier's position in the development's commercial food hall. It was a less profitable structure for Crane Capital than the original, roughly 11% lower return over the first 8 years. It was also, she believed, the only version of this deal that deserved to happen. Earl Gaines listened to all of it without moving. When she finished, he poured himself a second cup of coffee and looked at his hands for a moment. Then he said what changed. She told him the infrastructure analysis had changed. He looked at her over the rim of his cup and said that wasn't what he was asking. She looked at the table. She said, "Someone showed me a version of this town I hadn't looked at yet." Earl was quiet. Then he said he would think about it. She said she would be in Crestfield until Wednesday. She drove to Birchwood Trail that evening as the light was going flat and gray over the oaks. She knocked on the door of the 3-bedroom ranch. Denzel opened it, holding a coffee mug. He looked at her without surprise, the way a man looks when he already has an idea of what a knock means. She told him she had read the infrastructure filing. She told him she had seen his name. He looked at her. He did not say anything. She told him she owed him a direct conversation, not because of the filing and not because of the truck, but because of what she had let Nathan say in that parking lot without correction. She said she had walked into this county with a finished picture of what she was going to find, and she had not looked first. She said she was telling him that plainly, not to get something from him, not because it was useful, but because he had earned a direct conversation and she owed him one. Denzel held the mug. He looked past her for a moment at the oaks. Then he turned back to the kitchen and took a second mug from the cabinet, filled it from the pot, and set it on the table. He sat down. He did not say that things were fine. He did not say that she was forgiven. He made the next available gesture, which was coffee on a gray evening, and waited to see what she did with it. She sat down. They talked for 40 minutes. She asked 2 direct questions about the feeder breaker specification, and he answered both with the particular precision of someone who has the information organized in a place that never really went dormant. He told her she would want someone local to review the final infrastructure sections before the proposal went to the county utilities office. She asked if he would be willing to take a consulting role. He looked at his mug. She understood before he answered. Then she asked what the condition was. He said one condition, and it was not negotiable. All field work would be done locally. Any project meetings requiring travel would be scheduled with no less than 1 week's notice and could not be consecutive, because he had a daughter in graduate school in Chapel Hill who came home on certain weekends, and a neighbor's young woman he was informally mentoring, and a set of raised garden beds on Birchwood Trail that he intended to have ready when the person they belonged to came home. Victoria looked at him. She said accepted, no revisions. What happened next came faster, harder, and with consequences that Victoria Crane had not planned for but probably should have seen coming. When Nathan Foss received the revised project terms, he pushed back, not quietly. He had been with Crane Capital for 6 years and had built his professional identity around the financial model that Victoria was now reducing by 11 points over 8 years. He told her the partners would not approve it. He told her she was letting a personal moment in the field alter a fiduciary decision. He told her the community equity provision was structurally unprecedented in their portfolio and would create expectations on every future deal. She told him the previous model had a material risk factor the team had failed to identify. He told her the risk factor had been identified by a local electrician who drove a rusted truck and had no formal engagement letter with the firm. He said it with a particular tone, the specific register of a man who has made a decision about what kind of information's reliable based on who delivered it. Victoria was quiet on the phone for a moment, then she said, "Say that again." Nathan did not say it again. The line held its silence. Then she said, "I'm going to send you the infrastructure filing from the county utilities office. I want you to read the appendix. The name at the bottom of the technical design submission is the same man you just described. He designed the system we couldn't analyze from Atlanta. He knows it because he built it, and he told me about it while driving me out of a flooded road that I had no business being on. She paused. So I am going to need you to decide in the next 2 minutes whether you can do your job without the filter you just used, because I cannot have that filter on my team. Nathan was quiet. Then he said he needed to think. She said she would give him until morning. She said to take the full night because she needed his actual answer, not the managed one. He called at 7:14 the next morning and resigned. His voice was flat, controlled, the voice of a man who had made a decision overnight and arrived at work wearing it. He said he believed in the original terms and could not in good conscience execute a plan he thought was financially imprudent. She said she respected that. She said she would make sure his transition was fair. She said she hoped he would eventually understand that imprudence and revision are different things. The call ended. What followed happened in stages that nobody in Crestfield expected. Nathan Foss drove back to Atlanta and within 4 days had spoken to 2 of Victoria's capital partners. He had framed the revised project terms as a failure of financial discipline, the kind of personal moment decision-making that should concern institutional investors. He did not disclose that the infrastructure error had been material. He did not mention the filing or the name in the appendix. He presented a version of events in which a capable executive had let an encounter with a local tradesman alter a sound investment thesis for reasons that were more personal than professional. One of the partners called Victoria directly. She sent him the filing. She sent him the revised financial model with the corrected infrastructure costs. She also sent him the original risk assessment that Nathan's own analyst had produced before the feeder breaker correction, the one that showed an infrastructure exposure of over $2 million that the original model had not accounted for. The corrected version had eliminated that exposure entirely. The partner called her back 2 hours later. He did not sound the way she had expected. He said, "Your original model had a $2 million risk factor your team missed." She said, "Yes," he said, and a local contractor identified it. She said, "Yes," he said, and Nathan didn't disclose that when he called me. There was a pause. He said, "Send me the full infrastructure file." She did. Nathan Foss resigned from 2 advisory relationships within the following week, both of which had been made aware of the same selective account he had given the first partner. He did not make this information public. He did not need to. The community of institutional real estate investment in the Southeast is not as large as it presents itself, and the gap between what Nathan had said and what the documents showed was the kind of gap that does not stay private long. He was not ruined, but he was reduced. The phone stopped ringing the way it had rung before. The introductions stopped being made. He had told a partial story about a man he had dismissed in a parking lot, and the part he had left out was the part that changed everything, and eventually the people whose decisions depended on accurate information found out that Nathan Foss had known the full story and told a shorter one. That is a thing once known that does not unknow itself. 3 weeks after the coffee on Birchwood Trail, a revised proposal arrived at the Crestfield Town Council from Crane Capital Ventures. It included the feeder breaker replacement as a pre-development infrastructure commitment. It included the lease protection clause for existing Spain Street tenants. It included the community equity provision for local businesses, and it included, under the heading Infrastructure Review and Technical Consultation, one entry, Washington Electrical, Grid Infrastructure Advisory. Earl Gaines called Denzel the evening the proposal was announced at the town council meeting. He said, "That woman's not as bad as I thought." Denzel was in the backyard looking at Celeste's raised beds in the late light, thinking about what would need to happen before the ground softened. He said, "She's probably better than either of us thought from Wednesday morning." Earl laughed and said Denzel only said that because he'd had her coffee. Denzel said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. The call from Nathan's replacement came on a Thursday. Denzel was under a kitchen sink on Oak Street replacing a junction box that someone had wired badly and left for someone else to find. He listened to the consulting terms while lying on his back looking at the subfloor. The retainer was fair. The work was real. not ceremonial, but actual infrastructure review and specification writing for a commercial project that needed someone who understood both the engineering and the county system's particular history. He called back 9 minutes later when he was standing in the driveway, which was where he went when he needed to think clearly. He said he would accept the contract. He said one condition: all fieldwork local, all project meetings with 1 week's minimum notice. Not negotiable. The person on the other end said she would confirm with the client. Denzel said, confirm or decline, not discuss. Charlotte Vane, the new operations director, walked into Victoria's office in Atlanta and read the condition. Victoria looked at the project map on her left monitor, the section of County Route 7 marked in the infrastructure flag. She looked at it for a moment, then she said, accept it. No revisions. In Crestfield, the Silverado was in the side drive of the Birchwood Trail Ranch every morning when the sun came up, backed in the way a man parks when he might need to leave fast. Its red faded to something closer to brown along the wheel wells, the replacement mirror not quite matching the original. It had started every morning without complaint for 27 years. It would start the next morning, too. Somewhere a woman in a white Range Rover had laughed at it in a parking lot. That woman now knew what it was capable of. So did the county utilities office. So did the town council of Crestfield, Georgia. So did a 21-year-old named Ava, who had changed her major declaration to electrical engineering 2 weeks after her orientation, and who kept the business card Denzel had given her, plain white cardstock with nothing unnecessary on it, tucked inside the folder she still carried everywhere. And so did the raised beds in the backyard of the ranch on Birchwood Trail, turned and ready, waiting for the season to come around and for the person they belonged to come home. Sometimes the world walks past a thing and decides it has already seen enough to know. Sometimes it laughs. Sometimes it says 4 words in a hussy-feelinged room and moves on. And sometimes, further down the road, around the bend in the rain, the thing it dismissed is the only thing moving toward it. Denzel Washington was not the kind of man who needed the world to understand what it had walked past. He knew what he had built and what he was building and why. The grid he had designed still ran. The breaker he had specified still held the load. The beds in the yard were ready. The truck ran. That was enough, and it always had been.